Today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show, we're going to talk about the Lazy RPG Talk Show being ranked number 1 by Dungeons & Dragons Fanatics. Dungeon Craft did a review of the Dungeon Master's Guide that I thought was really good. We're going to talk about that. DM David has an article on his 25-year-old wish list for D&D, which I think is great. Elon Musk has words for Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. We're going to dive into that. Today, our main topic is going to be the anatomy of a situation, taking a look at an encounter at an adventure, a session that I ran for my game this past Wednesday, which I think is a really good example of how a situation can play out once we've set it up and then how we let it play out at the table. I think it worked really well, and I wanted to dive into that. And we're going to cover more questions for the November 2024 Patreon Q&A, all today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, here to talk about all things in tabletop role-playing games. The Lazy RPG Talk Show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, tools, adventures, scenarios, source books, and other material to help you run your tabletop role-playing games. They also get access to the awesome Sly Flourish Discord server, and you help me put on shows like this. To the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your outstanding support. I was very pleased and very happy and very humbled that Dungeons & Dragons Fanatics, a blog that talks about Dungeons & Dragons, had their top 10 D&D podcasts that aren't actual plays. And there are many excellent podcasts on this list. Some friends of mine that are on there. Morris's Unofficial Tabletop RPG Talk is on there. I love that podcast very much. I've been on it multiple times and enjoy it. Eldrick Lorecast is fantastic. I love listening to that. Mastering Dungeons is also great by my friends Teos Abadia and Sean Merwin. And I was very pleased to have been, and again, humbled to be ranked number 1 for the Lazy RPG podcast. So to Dungeons & Dragons Fanatics, thank you so much for that. To Eldrick Lorecast, who proclaims themselves the number 1 role-playing game podcast in all of the realms, I have a tagline that you might switch to instead, which would be Eldrick Lorecast, the number 1 podcast in all of the realms, except for the Lazy RPG Talk Show by Sly Flourish, available at slyflourish.com. So you might want to add that into your introduction. I'm just offering that up as a way that you might want to, something you might want to add to your own podcast. Anyway, very humbling experience. Thank you very much. And thank you for those of you who listen to the podcast. I greatly appreciate your support, and I hope you enjoy the show. It is my job and my goal to make a fun and entertaining show where you learn something for each one of these. Professor Dungeon Master over on Dungeon Craft had a great video. Of course, it's got a little bit of the clickbait with the "don't do it, Dungeon Master's Guide, don't do it." However, I think it is a really excellent video where he talks about the Dungeon Master's Guide, dives into it. And he had an opinion, which I believe is my opinion too, where he said, and I quote, it's the best Dungeon Master's Guide ever designed for official D&D. So I thought that was pretty profound. I'm not even sure I'm willing to say that, because there's a lot of different Dungeon Master's Guide and they have a lot of different stuff in there. But I thought it is, a very positive review of the Dungeon Master's Guide from somebody who often gives a very stern eye to Wizards of the Coast and the products coming out of D&D. And he brings up specifically that the Dungeon Master's Guide, the 2024 Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, is really good for new Dungeon Masters. And I agree with that. I think it is a fantastic Dungeon Master's Guide for new Dungeon Masters. One of the things that Professor Dungeon Master did in this video is he talked a lot about Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, my book that offers 8 steps for helping you prep your game. And then he said, you can also look at that. He said there are some things that are in the Dungeon Master's Guide that are similar to that, but there's also, if you're looking for more specifics about how to prep your game, you can look at Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. I thank him for bringing up Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master as much as he did during his video. I'm appreciative of that. And I agree. I think when I did my assessment of the Dungeon Master's Guide, I think it is definitely of the modern 5e Dungeon Master's Guides, I would say it is the best one for new Dungeon Masters. But I also believe that, in particular, the Level Up Advanced 5e Trials and Treasure book and the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide, both of those also have lots of things to offer Dungeon Masters that may be more useful in the long term. One of the things I worry about with the Dungeon Master's Guide is that it is kind of good up front, but do you really need it at the table other than for magic items? And I think there are more tools in Level Up Advanced 5e's Trials and Treasure, which I think is an absolutely excellent book, and in the Game Master's Guide, which offers the Tales of the Valiant Game Master's Guide, which offers a whole ton of different tools to help you run your game in lots of different ways. Both of those books are excellent as well. So I really hope that if you have the option of getting those books as well, I think you're going to get a lot of value from all 3 of these Dungeon Masters books. They're all really excellent. My friend DM David, who I ran into when we were at Gamehole Con, I hadn't seen him in a while. We had a really good conversation there, and he has an excellent video. If you've never subscribed to his blog, please check out DM David. It is not DM Dave. There is a DM Dave and a DM David, and I'm talking about DM David at dmdavid.com. You can find a link in the show notes. And he has an article about his 25-year wish list for D&D. And what I really love about this article is it takes the long view of this hobby. Instead of kind of being really particular about specific things that we think about with our hobby, he's looking at the big picture here. What are the things that from the second edition to third edition days that he was hoping to see? And he was there at Gen Con in 1999, so this is 25 years ago, where they were talking about their plans for third edition D&D. This is after Wizards of the Coast just bought TSR, and they were looking at a new version. Like, he even has his t-shirt, right? The third edition t-shirt that he picked up. And he had some really interesting ones. And it kind of shows what I liked about this article that I really enjoyed digging into was it shows the evolution of the game in a long time frame rather than like the things that specifically have changed since like 5th edition's initial release in 2016 or 2020 in 2014 to today, and all the different kind of specific things. He's looking really long term, 25 years. And so what were the things that he had? Unifying the game mechanics. He really felt like, how come you can't just roll a d20 and add a modifier and do a thing? And it turned out that's exactly what they did. So that idea, like if you look back at old versions of D&D, they had a lot of different tables, a lot of different rolls. Rogues, you rolled percentile dice to see if they could do things. Other people rolled other things. There was definitely like a roll under on ability checks, which I guess was more of a house rule than it was an actual rule. So there wasn't like a unified core mechanic. And now there's a unified core mechanic. It's been the same since 3rd edition for the past 25 years. And it works really, really well today. Smoothing the power curve for magic user advancement. So there's two angles to this. One angle was, wizards are too weak at low levels, which they fixed with things like cantrips, so wizards don't ever have to like resort to throwing darts or beating things with a quarterstaff. Although he argues that the power curve on the high side is still there. So he's got some interesting insights there. Getting rid of Thaco. There we go. Although Thaco came back in Wild Beyond the Witchlight as Thaco the Clown. 4, give complete rules for the magic schools and specializations. This worked because they actually had separate schools and specializations, and you could pick them and then pick the spells that were from them. Same, give rules for different clerics of different deities. That made its way in. Make spell statistics consistent. He has an interesting thing here about they never really did have like a consistent block to describe how spells work, and they still kind of don't. That spells are kind of described differently with different sort of mechanics as they go. Making spell power consistent, kind of goes up in there, and then we know things like Fireball are super powerful. Shorten 1-minute rounds, they did. Simplifying the overall experience, I would say they definitely did, even though they've made it crunchier in some areas. If you think back to the way that the game worked back even in early 3rd edition, but certainly 2nd edition, there was lots of elements that was like hard to get your hands around. Publish fewer rule books. I would say they do that. They publish fewer rule books than they certainly have before. And make healing spells consistent with hit points concept. What's interesting is the new version of 5e, the 2024 version of D&D, that one actually makes the amount that you heal more consistent with your hit points and with the amount of damage that you take. A lot of people think that makes it too easy. I actually think that it probably is needed, because I have certainly seen in my home games where smart players say you shouldn't even heal somebody until they're at 0, because they're going to take so much damage from a hit that your heal is not going to last more than 1 round. So I think that increasing the extra healing makes those heal spells more viable at different points of combat than just at the end. Anyway, really fun article. I highly recommend it. Take a look at DM David's 25 years ago, the wish list that he published. So here's a fun one. This past week, Elon Musk told WOTC and Hasbro to quote unquote burn in hell. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, said on his 200 million subscriber feed on his personal social network site, X, which he bought, that they should burn in hell. And in quote, nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to trash Gary Gygax and the geniuses who created Dungeons & Dragons. What the F is wrong with Hasbro and WOTC? May they burn in hell. Felt a little extreme. What exactly is he talking about? So he is specifically talking about the introduction to this book. This book is called The Making of the Original Dungeons & Dragons 1970 to 1977. It is an awesome book. I was not given a review copy for this. I asked my beautiful wife to buy a copy for me for our anniversary, and she did so. And I really thoroughly enjoyed going through this book. I think it is an excellent history of Dungeons and Dragons. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it as we dig into this conversation. But I want to start off by saying it's a really good book. So what was the issue with this? The issue was in the first 2 pages of this book, it describes that this book contains things that are problematic because they were written back in the 70s and 80s, and that, the things weren't good when they were done then, that they did alienate players. And they describe it, that there's definitely aspects of racism and sexism and slavery and all that kind of stuff, which is true. It's all true. Also, by the way, though, even if you aren't bothered by that stuff, it's 2 pages out of a 576 page history book. It's not even 2 pages. It's like 5 paragraphs within those pages. And so where this led to was that, Wizards of the Coast is trashing D&D. You don't make a 576 page, $100 book to trash D&D. Also, this book has in it full copies of the original versions of D&D that were ever made that had never been published before. So not only is it not trashing it, it has a complete true history, page by page, with letters, with little annotations that Gygax and Ellison had made, showing this the true history of this book. It is a fantastic book. But the idea was, because they dared to say that, hey, there are elements of sexism and racism and misogyny and other aspects of this book that are troubling, that they are trashing D&D. And really, they took it as a personal attack of Gary Gygax, where they felt like this trashing was saying that Gary Gygax is sexist. Well, you know who else said that Gary Gygax is sexist? Gary Gygax, who said, and I quote, "Damn right I'm a sexist." And by the way, if you're thinking that quote is out of context, and I'll link to it all in the show notes, that is the best part of that quote, by the way. The rest of the quote is really terrible. Terrible enough that I don't want to read it aloud on my show at all. That was the nicest part. That was the nicest part of the quote. Now, a common excuse is that, Gary Gygax was a man of his time, and that was what was going on at the time. That's not true. And the reason why that's not true is he is defending himself. In that post, which came from that quote came from a article from a piece that he wrote for a gaming magazine. So you're not a man of your times if you have to defend yourself like that. Because one of the excuses was, he's obviously being very sarcastic and he's just kind of poking people in the eye about it. That's a defense mechanism. And if that's a defense mechanism, that means you're defending yourself against something. And what he was defending himself against was arguments that he was being sexist. So he said, I've received arguments that I'm sexist. That means he's not a man of his time. He's arguing for that side. He also continued to defend his bigotry and his sexism as late as 2004. There are quotes that are on posts that are on EN World. You can go read them, where he continued to defend his attitudes of sexism, and he never recanted. Now, there are other firsthand accounts from people, and when all of this came out, this story's been going around now for a few months. It's only Elon Musk who kind of picked it up now. It's been going around for a while, and a lot of firsthand accounts, including some from family members. His daughter came out to talk about it. Other people that were with him during those times talked about it and said he wasn't sexist, that he was very wonderful to the women around him, and that there are creators today, creators in this industry, who have anecdotes about meeting female creators who met Gary Gygax and say he was a delight. I am sure those are true, because guess what? You can be both. You can be complicated. He was a complicated guy. We're not saying because he said these things, he's a monster and we need to throw the game away. We're saying he's a complicated dude, and the relationship that D&D has and that we have with D&D, that's complicated too. Life is complicated. Cory Doctorow, who I've been reading a lot about recently, reading a lot of his stuff recently, had a really good article where he talked about Harlan Ellison. Harlan Ellison was a writer that he highly respected, who also was very problematic to people, where he could be super nice to you if he was on your side, or he could just completely destroy you, including attacking women in his classroom to the point where they left the entire industry. People can be both, and people can be complicated. And the things that they do on one side do not discount or hide or bury the stuff that they did on the other side. In either case, all of these things can be true. And this is the reason why I wanted to talk about this were these main points that I'd like to offer up. And I'm hoping you will hear these points and think about them and consider them. And one is, You can love D&D and love the hobby and love the history of the hobby and still recognize these shortcomings in both the creators and the work itself. All of these things can be true. You don't have to immediately say, I'm throwing it all away because this thing was said, or I can never acknowledge the fact that these happened because it ruins my view of the game, which is kind of what Elon Musk is saying, right? He's kind of saying like, how dare you attack this genius of this wonderful game? You can be both a genius and make an incredible game that changed the entire world and still be a bigot. Like those things can be true, right? All of these things can be true together. Our hold on the hobby is stronger when we recognize and shine a light on its flaws, which is exactly what I think this book does. This book shows it completely. It has the full copies of the things that are talking about. And the problematic stuff that are described in the beginning are in the book, so you can see them in their context, in everything else. And you can also see all of the other incredible stuff that led to the game that we love today. It's all in that same book. If we bind ourselves so much to the idea that everybody is a hero and any flaw in that heroism, it has to be discounted because it hurts our image, our hang on to the hobby is too brittle. And all it takes is something to be true to shatter it. Instead, you can say, yes, he said those things. Yes, they were terrible. Yes, they may have led to women and minorities not being part of the hobby that we had for many decades. And still, it's an amazing game. These things can all be true. You get to decide how to change your view of someone's work when you learn more about them. Take in information, change your points of view. You don't have to do all or nothing, and we each get to choose. There are many other creators, many other artists, writers, musicians that we've all learned more about, and we decide what we're going to take from them and what we're not. And I think what we shouldn't do is omit information or immediately discount it because it hurts the idea of something that we loved. Things that we love can be problematic, and we need to accept that that is true. And we can still decide what our relationship is with that media. And it's something that I struggle with all of the time. And it's not an end state. It is a continual evolving situation. You might decide it's okay, I'm still going to listen to that music, or change your mind and say, you know what, I really can't anymore. You get to decide that for yourself, and you don't have to judge anyone else for whatever decision they make. If you're a cis-het white dude, like myself, this conversation's not about you. You don't get to say, well, in my experience, we never kicked any women out of a game, right? Talk to women, talk to them that have been in the industry. Trust me, lots of people have had problems like this in the past. Just because you've had your experiences as a cis-het white dude, that doesn't discount all of the experiences that other people may have had in this hobby. Listen to them and recognize the conversation's not about you. No one's in your home talking to you about what you have to believe and what you don't believe. You don't have to defend everything else because you're afraid that your entire grip on this hobby, your entire identity as a gamer is going to explode if you admit the fact that the guy who invented the hobby that you love made sexist comments. Not my whole life, but a good chunk of my life is wrapped around the TTRPG industry. And I love this industry to death. And I also recognize the flaws that it has. And I think it makes us stronger to look at those flaws and to understand them and to try to be better at this. It's okay to have complicated and evolving feelings about the hobby and its creators. I think that's healthy. I think struggling with it is healthy. Discounting it is not. And arguing with people is not. There's wonderful threads and interesting threads that also show all of the common arguments that people have when this kind of topic comes up. That is over on EN World. I will link to that in the show notes. But one poster in particular, clever nickname, who gave me permission to quote this on the show, said, "It's not about shaming Gary Gygax for being a bigot. It's about acknowledging the bigotry in our hobby so that we can do better going forward." That's what I believe, and that is what I think we can do. I think our grip on the hobby is far stronger when we recognize the flaws that it has had and how we can approach it in the future. This is a really good book. You should buy this book. This is a good Christmas gift. I hate to advertise Amazon stuff. I hate Amazon, but it's $50 on Amazon. It's half price. They're almost certainly losing money on it. So if you want, oh, I don't know how to say this. If you don't want Hasbro to really get a lot of money, you should buy it on Amazon. But on the other hand, you're giving Amazon a lot of money. So who do you hate worse, Amazon or Wizards of the Coast? But it's a really good book. $50 is an absolute steal. You could also go to your local game shop and support your local game shop by buying a copy locally or asking them to get a copy locally. And honest to God, it is a really amazing book. Like, this is a really, really good book. I love it. So please, yeah, give it a look. It's really outstanding. If you love the history of D&D, if you want to see what the original versions of D&D looked like, fantastic coffee table book that does that. It is called The Making of the Original Dungeons and Dragons, 1970 to 1977. So in my game on Wednesday, I had a really good situation. I had a really good adventure, a really good session. And I think the value of that session really showed how building a situation, setting things up, having the material you need, and then letting the situation evolve during the game really worked out. So this particular situation was called the infiltration of Red Eagle Tower. And I'm going to link to my actual game notes for it, just so you can kind of see what the general situation was. These are all following the 8 steps from Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master. If you want to see me prepping steps like this, I have a whole series of videos and podcasts where I prep my game every week, so you can dive in and see that specifically. But now we're going to look at like what it was like after. So the whole situation, as we set it up, was that the Queen's sister, who was under house arrest for a conspiracy to dethrone her sister, had been kidnapped by a group of rogues known as the Red Veils. The Red Veils is like a new group of assassins that have shown up in the city of Arches. And the characters found out that the Red Veil had infiltrated her villa, the villa where she was being kept, kidnapped her and took her down to a ruined tower known as Red Eagle Tower down in the lower reaches of the city of Arches. The characters had made their way in, so at the point in the adventure, the characters had made their way in through a cave at the base, the rocky base of the tower, which had a troll named Black Talons, or Black Fingers, Black Talons, Black Claw, something like that, and fought this troll on their way in. But that got to the first point of the situation that I think is really valuable, which I'll talk about, which was having multiple paths for the characters to go into the place was something that was really valuable for that. So the situation really began when they were they went through this natural tunnel underneath the tower, broke through a wall, and found themselves in the cellar beneath the tower. And I ended the previous session with a guard coming down the steps. So a couple of different things with the way the situation was set up that I think really helped is there were actually multiple factions of villains inside this tower that were working loosely together. There were the Red Veils, who were the top of the tier. They're the assassins. They're really good. They were really powerful. And then we have 2 other groups known as Hell's Scimitars and the Devil's Miscreants. And they were 2 like low-level gangs that the Red Veils had hired in order to do guard duty and other things like that. And there was about a couple dozen of them. I think we had about 24 Hell's Scimitars and Devil's Miscreants agents. One of the things that this did is by having these different groups is it meant there were different factions operating inside. The Hell's Scimitars might not like the Devil's Miscreants might not like Hell's Scimitars, Red Veils might not trust either of them. There was already like interesting complications that could exist with these different groups. And I didn't even really think about that too hard, but it ended up playing out very much during the scenario itself. I also had some key NPCs that were going to be there. We had Star. Star is an assassin who is actually the head of the Red Veils. I used a Forge of Foes monster stat block line for her. You can see it here in the notes. Made her a challenge rating 8. The characters, I think, are level 8. So yeah, the characters are level 8. So I made her a challenge 8. She probably could have been actually a little bit harder than that. But it didn't matter because I never actually faced her. We had Krissa the Whisper, who is the second in command of the Red Veils and is the one who's actually in charge of the operation that's going on here to capture the Queen's sister. And then I had 2 ogres who never showed up, Theric and Gavish, which were gladiator ogres and bodyguards of Star. So that was kind of what I had prepped. Then I had monster stat blocks for the Hell's Scimitars and Devil's Miscreants, and I had 2 different levels of them, Foot Soldiers and Cutthroats. I actually think I never used the Cutthroats. We were tougher. I ended up just sticking with the Foot Soldiers, the CR 1/2 Foot Soldiers, because it meant that they could drop relatively quickly. I set up, as I do, all of my secrets. One of the advantages of the secrets here is that they could learn information about what was going on in the tower as they went. They could learn it from talking to people. They could overhear people having conversations. They could just pick things up with insight checks and investigations to kind of pick things up. So there's lots of different things that they could learn about what was happening in the tower. So that was pretty much the setup that I had. I also had a map of this. So I had a map. Again, I just grabbed a Dyson map. I actually grabbed a couple of Dyson maps for a couple of different things. But one of them was Red Eagle Tower is the name of the map that Dyson Logos has. And I used this map for my game. And what I did is I printed it out, and then I took a pen and I drew some stuff on there. And I annotated it by hand. And some of the annotations I had were mostly like what's where. So I said, like, there's a guard perch, there's a dining hall where the guards eat, there's like a room where the guards kind of sleep and rest, there's a main courtyard area where guards are kind of on patrol, there's a whole bunch of different parapets where the guards are kind of keeping watch, and then there's the actual cell where Atriva is. I added a cellar. So I added a cellar that actually goes below the ground level that really just had a natural tunnel that led into it, and they broke through the wall to get into the cellar. So one thing right up front that I did that I think worked really well is I accepted the fact that there were going to be multiple entrances. So here's a real tip that I want to offer, which is not only do you offer multiple ways in. So the idea is like, well, the tower's open at the top. Maybe they could drop in and fly. Maybe they could pretend to be somebody else. Maybe they could go in disguise. Maybe they could try to infiltrate it by climbing over the parapets. Or maybe they could go in below. One of the things that I almost always do is I have like another secret entrance that's below the place, a secret tunnel that exists beneath whatever the location is, that you could fill with all kinds of monsters. You could have black puddings, or you could have other kinds of, non-sentient monsters that lurk down below. Old crypts with undead lurking around in them. So you can build kind of a lower level of whatever location you have, and the players can decide if they want to go into it. What I've generally found is whenever I add that kind of path, almost like a secret path that they learn about. Yeah, you could go up to the front door and kick it in and start fighting people. Yeah, you could sneak in and go over the parapets. Yeah, you could fly in from above and try to do it. But the minute you add like a secret entrance that says like, oh, but there's also like a waterway that leads out through a cave below, almost always the characters say, ooh, we're going to go that way. So not only, whenever you add that secret path, you're not railroading them because they can always choose one of the other ones. But I will tell you that I bet you 2 out of 3 times they're going to end up picking that secret passage that exists underneath the tower as the way to infiltrate the tower. And that doesn't mean it's any less challenging. It's actually kind of easier for you because you can put like normal dungeony sort of fights in it when they choose that. So one of the things you'll notice here is I don't actually say, oh, here are where all of the bandits are. Instead, at the top, you can see where I wrote 24 hired bandits, 8 red-veiled bruisers and assassins. And I drew a little line that says, some are hell scimitars, some are devils miscreants. I didn't fill it out any more than that. I never, not until I was running the game did I decide how many of them were in any given place. And sometimes I would roll a die. I just rolled, like I said, 2d6 guards will be in the dining hall, and I rolled and it was 3, right? I rolled a 1 and a 2, and so there's only 3. And I'm like, that sounds right. It's a little light in the dining hall right now. So what was interesting is how they approached it and what they ended up doing. So I mentioned that the characters all made their way through this secret tunnel. Again, they're 8th level, so they have a lot of stuff going on, right? They have a lot of capabilities, a lot of things that they can do. And I think we had 6 players, so we had a good number of players. So they went in through the lower area, and they saw somebody coming down the stairs. A bunch of them hid behind stuff while did somebody disguise themselves then? I think somebody claimed to be one of the other groups. Oh, we're devil's miscreants down here. We were actually bringing up food for somebody else. And he was like, I don't remember anybody else coming down here. And so there were some conversations and stuff like that. And I think they ended up not convincing him, and they grabbed him and knocked him out and then threw him down the cave and then built the wall up on the cave. Then one of the characters, I think, went invisible and snuck up to see what was going on and saw that there were 2 other guards in the room right above. This is at that ground level, the ground level part of the map. And they looked around to see if there were 2 other guards, and they saw them. And the bard did disguise self to look like the guy who went down, and then went up and said, hey, I need some more help bringing some of this stuff down. And the other 2 guards were like, oh, and then they came down like, wait, who the hell are all you? There was a little bit of conversation, and then they bonked, and I think they ended up killing a couple of those guys. And then they said, and now they switched to be a different one. So at this point, the wizard says, I'm going to go invisible, goes invisible, and goes, they don't know where she is, right? They know they're here to get Atreida. Atreida is the queen's sister, but they don't know where she is. So they're trying to like do recon without alerting the whole base, the whole tower, to find Atreida before anything else. So they think she's way up at the top of the tower. Turns out she's not, but they went way up top of the tower. So they go all the way up the tower, 4 stories up. They see that there's guards who are looking at a tower, usually 2 guards per level that are looking around, walking around, making sure nobody's infiltrating from any other angle. They get all the way to the top and they saw that there were 2 red veils in the red veil meeting room that are talking to each other. And they're describing the fact that the boss lady, the woman who's running this whole thing, is down there with Atreida, convincing her of Star's plan, that she can be the next queen. All she has to do is bend the knee to Star, and she can be the next queen. So now the players learn some secrets by overhearing the discussions going on between 2 members of the Red Veil. I think, so this is where zany shenanigans started to happen. So the character, whose name is Andrew Armageddon, he's a wizard, he went over, put his hand on, there was a red veil woman and a red veil dwarf man, like an elven woman and a dwarf man, puts his hand on the elf woman, the red veil assassin, and dimension doors all the way back to the basement again. So he breaks out of invisibility, grabs her, and teleports. And the dwarf sees it, and he's like, "What the hell?" Right? So then she's now in the basement with all of them, and they go and attack her. And she's actually really tough. She's a red veil assassin. She's no pushover. And she, hits him a few times, but I mean, it was 6-on-1. So she goes down. Now, what I didn't do is say like, oh, I'm going to add a bunch of new monsters. And like, was this battle a challenge or not? I didn't worry about any of that. I knew that one creature is not going to be very effective against a whole group of characters, but it didn't matter. It was really cool. And that's the way the situation went. But then the other part of the situation is now the dwarf is like, what is going on? So he goes outside first because he's not sure where they teleported to. He doesn't know where they went, right? He knows like somebody just grabbed and teleported, and I don't know who it was, and I don't know where they went. So he goes running outside to the guards. I rolled dice to see like every time, this is where you use like an oracle die. Is he going to go out or is he going to go down? Well, let's find out. And we rolled, and I said he went outside. So I made a little countdown clock, like a Blades in the Dark style countdown clock on like how soon it was going to be before he alerted all the guards or found them or whatever. And I started off by saying like, it's going to be about 4 rounds. How many rounds is it going to be before he makes his way down? Filled in my clock. He went outside, didn't see anybody, starts going down and says, somebody just grabbed them up. And I think the bard turned into her and told him. So he comes running down the stairs. So I got to go back. So she runs up, the bard runs up looking like her, tells the guards that are in the dining hall, these are members of the Devil's Miscreants, and says, there's something going on outside, head outside. And because they listen to her, they immediately do what she says. Like, they don't even ask why, they just go outside. So now they're gone. Then the dwarf comes down and she says, we've been betrayed. The Devil's Miscreants are trying to steal her, and they attacked, and they're right out there. And he looks at her, and he looks at the door, and he kicks open the door and starts killing the other guards. And they're like, they close the door and move away, and they're like, well, that situation's solved, right? We just got a red-veiled assassin with a pair of axes who's going and indiscriminately killing Devil's Miscreants because he believes they were betrayed. So then the rest of the group is like, okay, like things are definitely going on now. They learned that Star is coming, right? They found out that Star is going to be here any minute, and that they're going to give Atreida over to Star. So they're like, we got to move. So they go down the stairs, and now they see another red-veiled mercenary with a bunch of hell scimitars. And they say, the Devil's Miscreants betrayed us, and so-and-so is out there killing them. And the hell scimitars are like, we never could trust those jackasses. We hated those guys. We know that was, we knew they were wrong the minute we saw them. And so now there's a war going on between these gangs. And then when they go, now they've switched to look like the dwarf. The bard switched to look like the dwarf, told the other red veil, by the way, I think those hell scimitars are also going against them. I think we're being betrayed 2 different ways. And they're like, really? And I had them roll checks and stuff like that because the red veils are pretty clean. And they're like, yeah. And so now all the gangs are fighting each other. So then they were like, well, we still have to get Atreida, right? We still got to go find her. They found her and they saw that she was behind a big locked door. They know that I forgot where it was, what her name was. They know that Krissa the Whisper, who is the leader of the Red Veils here, is in with her. So they go and knock on the door, or they get the Red Veil guards to knock on the door. She comes out. She's like, what? And they said, what did they say? Like, oh, everything is going to hell in a handbasket. All of the gangs are going, we need to get her out of here right now. And we have a passageway down in the cellar to get her out. And Krissa's like, looks around. She's like, okay, we'll meet Star outside of the tower, but we'll use you whatever they said, like, we've been infiltrated by evildoers and they all got in through the basement. So we need to go to the basement. So Krissa the Whisper and the two remaining red veiled mercenaries or red veiled assassins grab the sister, who's like, unhand me, like, get your hands off of me, right? Like, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And they drag her all the way through and get her down in the basement. And when they get to the basement, she's like, wait a minute, what the hell's going on? And that's when the characters attack. So then they had 3 assassins versus 6 characters. The characters still had a pretty straightforward time. It was not a very difficult fight for them to fight the 3 because they had separated everybody out. Battles are still going above. They kill them. I think they killed, what did they do? Oh, they killed 2 of the 3 assassins. And the 3rd looked like she was going to run. And they said, we're going to let her run. Or the bard who was still shapeshifted, a lot of things happened. The bard who was still looking like one of the red veiled assassins said, go, let's get out. We got to go tell Star what's going on. And she said, sure, I'm going to go do that. And she ran out the door. She ran out the cave entrance. And then the bard then created an illusion that made it look like the cave collapsed, killing the sister, right? It made the sister look like she got crushed underneath rocks. So then the one escaped red-veiled assassin now believes that the sister was killed in a collapse of the tunnel behind her. And that's what she tells Star. The characters, meanwhile, wait until she's gone. They wait a little bit. They hear the commotion up above, and they're like, "Okay, now let's go, and we'll take her with us." And they take her with them. They leave, and as they go, they see Star, the leader of the Red Veils, riding in on a wyvern with 2 ogre guards that are running along on the ground, heading towards the keep. And they're like, "Well, whatever. Like, our goal is not fighting them. Our goal is getting her back to safety, and we've got her to safety." And at which point they started talking to her about, like, well, what does she want, right? And the whole question was, which side is she on? Like, and she, they had heard, hey, the Red Veils were trying to convince you that you could be queen. They would assassinate the current queen and put you in as queen. And they're trying to figure out, like, is that what she wants? So there was a fair bit of a conversation with her about what she wants. And my big thought about she doesn't want to go back to her keep. She's been there for like 12 years. She wants to leave. And she's like, and I don't think I want to be queen either. I was 18 years old when that whole conspiracy happened. I didn't even know what was going on. I know people were killed. My mother was assassinated during that. I didn't have anything to do with it, but it didn't matter because I was part of this Golden Dawn conspiracy, and I was arrested and given life in a keep. And everybody's like, well, it's this beautiful villa. What do you care? But being stuck in the same beautiful villa, never able to leave again, is it's still a cell is still a cell. So she's like, what I'd really like to do is just leave the city. And that left a lot of complications for the characters. I'm like, well, who do they tell? The person who gave them the quest wanted her returned, and they had to, like, figure out from their NPCs what they want. 2 different NPCs that the characters work with. One of them wants her dead because she sees her as a risk to the throne. As long as she's alive, people are going to try to get her on the throne, and the life of the actual queen is going to be at risk. And that's the spy mistress. The spy master, Rosalind Zesh, is like, look, I would have killed her long ago, except the queen doesn't want her dead. And then the other person is the head of the Golden Knights, and named Halfcloak. And she said, Bianca Halfcloak, I think is her name. No, something like that. And she just wants her arrested and put back in the tower, right? She wants her arrested and put back in her villa. So then the players have to decide, well, what are we going to do? And that took some careful navigation of like making sure the players are good with things and making sure that along with the characters, because that's a situation where you don't want somebody to feel like they got betrayed or that they were betraying somebody else or something like that. So we had to be very careful with it. And that hasn't been fully figured out yet. We're going to figure that out at the beginning of our next session. But talking to one of the players about what their thoughts are, I think it's going to go in a direction that's going to be really fun. So that's kind of an example of like, you can think about how it played out during the game. And one thing that clued me in on the idea that this might be an interesting thing to talk about on the show is that one of the players said, well, I think we just wrecked all of Mike's encounters. And I looked at it and I'm like, well, that's my trick. I don't have any encounters, right? Like all I've got are these little bowls with little things in them and descriptions of stuff. And I decide where they go based on what the situation is. So you didn't ruin anything. We created an awesome story. I had no idea that's how it was going to play out. The players loved it. They were never really challenged in a combat perspective, but lots of challenge of like how to do what they were doing and what decisions to make. And they made some really smart choices. And it played out really well. And I think that's what made it really fun. And that idea of like, this is how the lazy DM 8 steps is supposed to work, right? This is an example of exactly how a situation works, which is I know the characters, I know where it's going to start. Like I had the strong start of the character, Benkar Hellgazer, one of the Devil's Miscreants, is coming down the stairs. So there's a thing that's happening right now that they have to deal with, right? I knew generally the scenes. You can see what my scenes look like. Deal with Benkar, infiltrate the tower, rescue the Queen's sister, and face the Red Veil and escape. All those happened, but that's as much as I had about what kind of plot was going to occur. I had a bunch of secrets of things they could learn while they were there. They learned a lot of different ways. I had some notable NPCs listed, so I'd remember names. I did some Forge of Foes stats, so I had some stats that I could use pretty easily. I had, monsters was basically just other members of the and Devil's Miscreants, and even then I didn't use these cutthroats. Like I never actually used them. Now treasure, I had some treasure and some really cool treasure, and there was never really an opportunity for them to get treasure, so they never really got anything from this. Now, maybe they could be rewarded this from quest NPCs, but probably I'm just going to kick this stuff forward and they're going to find it in another treasure hoard some other time. So that is going to be pretty interesting. But I thought that this situation was a really good example of how all of these steps play out during a game to build a situation that is highly dynamic, where zany things are occurring that the players didn't plan on, that they didn't expect, but the choices they're making are having direct impact. I never kind of like pushed back and said like, no, you can't convince him to do that. He'd never do that. It was like, no, that sounds really fun. So yes, the fact that there are like 6 Devil's Miscreants out on the parapets who were told to be there, and then another Red Veil guy comes out and starts killing him with an axe, that sounds really fun to me. So we're going to go with it. So I hope that gives you an idea of like the style that I talk about and the way that the steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master work and how they can actually relate to a crazy dynamic situation with lots of zany stuff going on that the players really enjoyed, I really enjoyed, and it was really, really fun. So thank you for that. I hope that was useful. Patrons on Sly Flourish, as I mentioned, get access to lots of different things. And one of the things they get access to, one of the things that I've been working on, is a new set of adventure scenarios for the City of Arches as part of the Key of Worlds campaign outline. I'm doing these because I'm actually running these in my home game, and I can take some of the notes and situations that occurred in my home game, and I can bring them forward into a series of short 4-page adventure scenarios that follow the steps of the Key of Worlds scenario from the City of Arches. These are available. They're kind of coming out once every couple of weeks, and they are available to hero tier subscribers of Sly Flourish. This is the $4 hero tier subscriber, and one just dropped last week that I thought we'd take a quick look at, which is called Tomb of the War King. So the Tomb of the War King is the 3rd scenario that's coming out. It's intended for 3rd level characters, for 3rd or 4th level characters, as part of the Key of Worlds. And the Tomb of the War King is one of the locations where the characters can get an artifact known as one of the Blackfire artifacts. These artifacts are the artifacts they can use to light the Blackfire braziers, which are sort of the tier 2 and above parts of the adventure. There are these 3 Blackfire braziers. You have to light all 3 of them in order to open a door. Other people are trying to go and light them as well. And there are 2 artifacts that can light these things. One is known as the Staff of Severlin, and the other one is called the Sword of Eryxius. This adventure is about finding the sword of Eryxias. It all involves the characters going to a tomb of this war king and recovering the sword from the tomb, while also figuring out about the tragic tale of what occurred at the tomb of the war king. So this one has a pretty big backstory, which you can find under the fall of the war king. All the scenarios have like an adventure scenario. They all mention the fact that this is not a traditional adventure. It is not a scene-by-scene played-out thing. Your intention is to take these 4 pages and use them to help you build an adventure around it. You get to decide what hooks are going to draw you in there. You get to move the monsters around from locations, just like we were talking about in building the situations out. It's giving you all of the components that you need in order to build an adventure from it, and give you some structure, and give you a location and describe that location for you so that it's helpful to you, but not spelling out the adventure itself, because that's really something that you can bring to the table, is to make the adventure your own and make it something that's going to work well for your group. I'm not going to dive into the whole backstory. If you pick it up on Patreon, you can see the entire backstory. The tragic tale about a king who felt like the way to prove his strength was murder his favorite son, who was just a nice guy, and in doing so doomed his entire family because his queen was so distraught that she hired a group of brutal assassins to murder everybody, including herself and everyone else. And all of them were entombed in this tomb as kind of a warning to say, hey, hubris can be too much. As you can see, they're outlined. So we have like the adventure summary, the fall of the war king, secrets and clues for the secrets of the war king. These are things they can discover. The blade, since it's the main MacGuffin for the adventure, there's a section about the blade and where you might find it and what its purpose is, and the idea that you can move it around. Key NPCs, so that you know who the NPCs are that you might want to keep track of. And these are including dead people, because the stories of these dead people keep coming up. What are the adventure hooks that can bring you in here? Like, what are the different ways that you could use this scenario? The scenario is intended to be part of this big campaign, but it doesn't have to be. You could just grab this and change the hook a little bit and really just say, whole goal is just going to get the sword. You don't care about the Blackfire Braziers. You don't care about any of the rest of it. How you got here, it can really work. Traveling to the tomb, like how do you get to the tomb? Where is it in the City of Arches? Inhabitants. So the inhabitants is actually like a random encounter list. You can decide who you want to put in what room or when you want to roll the encounters. But we have 20 different encounters that might occur while you're traveling through the area. Same thing with like traps and hazards. We have a section of different traps that can occur here. You can roll and decide when they come in. I kind of made them generic as far as DCs and damage done, so that we don't have to make every single one of them unique. Instead, you have base stats for any of these, and then you can flavor them with the flavor of the thing. The Blade of Eryxias itself is kind of a specialized magic weapon that evolves. So I have a section on the blade and how it evolves. Where to move the blade around. So if you don't want the adventure to go too long or too short, you can move the blade to make it a little bit, to fit the time that you've actually got at the table. And then treasures that the characters might discover in other areas of the tomb, including monetary treasure, consumable treasure, and other permanent magic items they would find. Then we have the tomb locations. We have a map. The map also has a VTT version of it that's in the pack, so you can put it into a virtual tabletop. And the locations that exist here, the different locations of the 18 rooms are all in here, and that describe them. Again, they don't build out an entire scene. It doesn't talk about what monster is in what room. Sometimes there's a little hint of a suggestion, like Area 7 is the pool of woe where spirits of the Queen's handmaidens flow in cursed waters. You get to decide if that's an encounter or if that's just a discovery, right? What makes sense for you is what makes sense. And then where to go to next. Once you finish this adventure, where do you go to next? As part of the path. The further adventures say these are the next stages that you might go to in the path. So this is the third, I think. I think this is the third of these scenarios. I actually have about 7 or 8 of them written now, and I'm regularly going through and cleaning them up and then posting new ones about every other week or so. This is the third of them, but I really like this. They're fun for me to write. I think that they're very useful for people, and I hope that you check them out. Again, this is known as the Key of Worlds Adventure Scenario Path and is available to Hero Tier subscribers of Patreon. Every month on the Sly Flourish Patreon, we have the Patreon Q&A. Any patron can ask any RPG related question. I answer all of the questions every Friday morning on that Q&A, and then some of those questions I bring here to the show so we can dive in a little deeper. Great Diviner Game says, what's one of your favorite monster abilities to excite players at the table? That's a really good question. And I think for me, the answer is none of them. I don't think, my feeling, and I've discovered this the more I have run Forge of Foes monsters, and the more I've run them, and sometimes I don't use any special abilities on them at all. They are just straight monsters who go and hit and do damage, is that the players really don't care. that the players want to see their characters do neat things. They want to knock people prone. They want to push people around. They want to do stuff. I can't think of many times where a monster has done a move and the players think like, well, that's cool. There are times where they're expecting monsters to do things and are disappointed when it doesn't happen. An example would be Dragon's Breath and Fireballs and things like that. When characters see spellcasters, they immediately scatter to the edges of a map because they don't want to be hit by fireballs. When they see a dragon or anything that could be like hitting, they're like, I want to spread out. So there's tactical choices that they make based on the things they think that monsters are going to do. But I don't know many circumstances where I can think of a monster ability that players really like. I think that instead what we find is that monster abilities, particular monster abilities, change how the players can deal with situations, and that part is fun. That idea that you have to spread out or you're going to get hit with a fireball or you're going to get hit with a dragon's breath. Or the idea that like we need to be careful about hitting this guy in melee because he's got a damage shield. I've actually had players who tell me they hate damage shields, right? Like the damage shield is one of my favorite abilities because it's a way to keep up continual threat regardless of whatever is happening to the monster. Players don't like it because they're like, I feel like I take damage every time I do damage, damage out and damage in. They don't like it, but it's like, yeah, but it's really a good balance thing. So, there are other kind of ways where you can put auras around creatures. They have to worry about an aura. Or ranged attackers, for example, if you can find ways to get cover from ranged attackers, you're doing things that help them. But I think for me, the monster abilities is more about the style and the kind of monsters that we put on the table. And I think like we can really think of about 4 different monster types. These almost exactly match the monster types that existed in 4th edition of D&D. Minions, really lots of low-level creatures that the characters can deal with areas of effect and things like that. They love to see monsters with low hit points that they can destroy with one hit. They love one-shotting things. So lots of low-level monsters is one. What they call like the wolf pack. The wolf pack is sort of like one monster per character that are appropriately challenging to face one monster per character, the sort of normal monster. Elite monsters, again, I'm going to use the 4th edition style. Elite monsters are bigger monsters that usually are a 2-to-1. They challenge 2 characters for every one monster. Those are kind of elite monsters. And then you have your boss monsters or solo monsters, which are usually even more powerful than that. The trick is, one thing that players love to do is gang up on solo monsters. So those solo monsters almost always need some way to protect themselves or to stay away from characters and their damage enough to not get pinned down and destroyed too quickly, because players love to destroy bosses, which is actually why I think having 2 or 3 bosses as elites rather than having a big solo is actually a more fun tactically built situation. But a tough part of this question is I really don't think that there are a lot of abilities where players really like the monster ability that they see. If you disagree with me, let me know. As a player, what are the abilities you think are really cool to see when monsters have them? I don't really see many of them. Maybe that's a flaw of mine. Spike says, I really enjoy campaign outlines you have for your website and on the City of Arches. I actually ran your Harvester of Worlds campaign outline pretty successfully. Do you have any advice for making your personal campaign outline? However, I find them helpful even if I divert wildly from them eventually. I would really like to make my own. You can use the models that I've got, but it's I think an important thing to remember is the models that I'm creating for other people. When I write them, I'm writing them so other people can use them. I think your own models might definitely be different, and you can just think of like the general beats. There's a reason why I don't really offer campaign outlines as a thing in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and instead I think you can focus on the villains. Who are the villains and what are they doing? And you can have a villain per tier, you can have the villains and their quests, and that can kind of become your outline. And the nice thing about that is it's a more dynamic situation, that when you are setting up villains and those villains have quests, and you can see this in City of Arches as well. City of Arches, we have villains, and the villains have stages of what are the things that they're doing at different stages. And so the one I was talking about earlier in this show with Star had stages, and stage 1 was starting to assassinate the members of the Black Hand. She'd already been doing that. Stage 2 was run this coup and try to kidnap the queen's sister and use her to usurp the throne. Stage 3 is killing the queen and taking over the Golden Council. So they hit her in stage 2. That changes the outline, right? For that particular thing, it changes the outline. I'm also interweaving multiple campaign outlines together in my own campaign. We're doing City of Art, we're doing the Key of Worlds campaign arc, but I'm also throwing in elements of the Nameless King campaign arc, and I'm throwing in these ideas from Star and some other side quests and stuff like that, which is how these things really play out. So I don't think building your own campaign outline for your own campaign, we want to do it. There's that drive to do it, but I don't think that that's actually the best approach. I think that instead, that focus on the villains and what they're doing and what paths they're taking and what quests they're on, that builds a more dynamic situation that can act and react along with the characters as you're building your game. Mighty Space Ghost says, I'm a recent addition to the hobby, only starting in 2019. That's 5 years ago. You're not recent anymore. About the time I started playing, a certain event happened that led to everyone being at home. Yes. So my only experiences with TTRPGs are online. What kind of tips would you give to someone who is transitioning from online only DMing to an in-person setting? That's a great question. And it's something that not quite the same way because I had run in-person games, but I went through about a 2.5 year period where we didn't play any games in person. All our games were online, and only much later did we get back to going in person again. And it was really strange going back to in-person gaming. I don't think that there is I don't think it's that hard. I actually think it's going to be easier to go to in-person gaming than online gaming because you're kind of removing some of the variables. Probably the trickiest bit for me was, how do I handle maps? What am I supposed to do with maps? And that's because the tools for running maps online are so much easier to use and so much better and so much more cost effective than maps and miniatures being used at a physical table. So that's one question. But my solution for that is to use a Pathfinder flip mat and wet erase markers. I have been using those now. I've tried a bunch of different mapping solutions over the time, and a Pathfinder flip mat, a blank flip mat. They have these Pathfinder basic flip mats, they're called. You can buy them. They're about $10 to $20. You can get them at your local game shop. And you want to get the basic ones that have nothing on them so that you can draw your own maps on them. And then get wet erase markers. I really like Stedler brand wet erase markers are my favorite ones, but they can be kind of hard to get, especially medium point Stedler markers are hard to get. But I find them to work much better than dry erase markers. This is something I've been thinking a lot about and spending a lot of time with recently. And there's Crayola wet erase markers too. They're not very good, but they can kind of work. And the mapping was the hardest part. And with mapping, it's just, you want to get used to drawing maps out. And what I do is I draw small scale maps right on there so they can see the overall layout of whatever location they're in. And then if I need to draw a larger room for a combat map, I can do that. But I actually still run a lot of theater of the mind. And even the small descriptions are enough for people to see like generally what's going on. But I would say that's probably the hardest part. The other hard part is just making sure you have the materials that you need in order to run your game. I have articles and videos where I've talked about the physical materials that I use when I'm running a game at a table, but you'll want to make your own checklist and double check your checklist. I had the very embarrassing situation recently of going to my friend's house. This was a couple weeks ago, going to my friend's house to run a game. And I had like a big Dwarven Forge set up and I had all these miniatures and I had all my books and I forgot my dice. I didn't have dice. And it's like, how embarrassing is that? I've been playing for 30 years and I forgot my dice. I had to borrow people's dice like a, I don't even know, like a noob. So like, write your checklist and then check your checklist before you pack all your stuff up and go, or before the game is going to happen. Go down your checklist and see all the stuff that you have. I have an article that talks about the things that are really helpful to me, so I will link to that article in the show notes. But that to me is the big one. What are the items that you actually physically need at your table in order to run it? There are other tools and tricks too. I really like the lazy monster tokens, which are tokens. It's going to cost you about $20 or $30 for the materials, but you can make like 90 different tokens, generic tokens that you can use for monsters and characters. That works really well. Those little acrylic stickers or little epoxy stickers and a 1-inch hole punch, and you can either print a picture or take like a Magic the Gathering picture, put the epoxy sticker over it and make a little token. Works really, really well. Easy to do, cheap, and you can make any kind of tokens that you want. So there's a lot of tricks like that. I have articles on Sly Flourish that talk about a lot of that sort of stuff, so you can dive in there. As far as like interaction with players and things like that, I don't think it's that bad. I think that a lot of it is going to come pretty straightforward to you when you're actually playing. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. And I'll tell you, I very much enjoy playing games in person. It makes a difference to me. I don't want to say that playing online, like I play games online too. One of my 3 games is an online only game. And the fact that we can play it as regularly as we're playing is because it's online. So I don't think one is better than the other, but I'll tell you, I really enjoy playing in-person games. So really good question. Friends, I want to thank all of you for hanging out with me today while we talked about all things in tabletop role-playing games. I hope you enjoyed this show. If you did, and you want to see more stuff like this from me, the best way to do so is subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. There is a link down in the show notes. It is absolutely free to sign up. You get a free adventure generator for signing up, and you get a weekly RPG-related article with links to all of the other work that I do embedded in that article. You can also support me directly on Patreon. Patrons get access to all kinds of cool things like the adventure scenarios that I was talking about earlier, tips, tricks, tools to help you run your game, lots of stuff that you get for being a patron of Sly Flourish. And most of all, you help me put on shows like this. And you can pick up any of my books, including Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, Forge of Foes, Lazy DM's Companions, and others at the Sly Flourish bookstore. Links for all of that are in the show notes. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.